So, Gene, let's bring in John McCafferty. John, welcome back. Nice to see you. Gene, just a moment ago, was giving the inflation numbers for July. And as she mentioned, markets are clawing their way back, something you had said back in June. You thought you were very confident that was going to happen. What's especially interesting, I think, is that it's actually not really driven by some big piece of financial news.
That's right. And thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure to see you both. And so as we make our way through the economic cycle, there are periods where the markets are higher, there's lower, and this is why we talk to people about maintaining a long-term perspective so that you don't miss out on these recoveries. And you're right. I mean, it might have been the recent clawback is possibly more of an emotional reaction rather than a data-based reaction. So, today we're talking a lot about inflation and what's the difference between maybe headline inflation and core inflation and why is one used versus the other. So headline inflation, as Gene mentioned, it does include energy and food. And those two components tend to be a lot more volatile than the rest of the goods and services in the basket. So it's a good metric to use for long-term projections, okay? So generally policymakers, economists, they might opt to use headline inflation, which includes energy and food, for maybe long-term comparisons of, say, wages, wealth, rates of return, Social Security payments, whereas core inflation is a much better use for a short-term assessment of what's going on. It's less volatile because it doesn't include food or energy. And so usually economists and policymakers prefer to use core because in general, it's a more consistent and a truer representation of what's going on with inflation.
Sorry, go ahead, Gene. You seem like you want to jump in.
Well, Soledad, how we often talk about how we like to control the things that we can control. The economists sitting on high and the policymakers in Washington, I think, are trying to do the very, very same thing. They recognize that both food and energy they're historically more sensitive to geopolitical events and swings in supply and demand. And if you look at what's going on right now, we've got war, right? We've got extreme weather, we've got natural disasters, we've got still the effects of the global pandemic on the supply chain. All of these events have had a dramatic impact on food prices and energy prices. So by factoring them out, Washington and other governments, I guess, get a better sense of what's really going on.
All that long list, though, is also known as life. And it seems crazy to me. I get that you're saying it's volatile, right? So you take your highs out because it kind of messes up the measurements. But at the same time, there seems to be something, I don't have a better word than a little bit crazy, of removing things that people very much feel are indicators of inflation, right? If you're going to take food and you're going to take energy out,
yeah, that's
those are biggies.
That's a great point. And I think people struggle with that. And I'm no different than any of you listening, where that tends to be what we consume the most of is food and energy. It's like, well, wait a second. Why wouldn't you include that number? It can seem disingenuous when that's what we spend a lot of our money on, and yet you have a policymaker saying, no, we're not going to use that number. And you might be listening or watching and thinking, well, of course you're going to use the lower number. It makes you look better. But the issue is, the operative word here is volatility. And we're seeing it now, where maybe 3 or 4 months ago, energy was surging, and it's still higher. But right now, the average price of a gallon of gas in the United States is about $4.16. That's down about 17% from the prior month. So things are coming down. And so going back to this concept of volatility and why there's a difference between headline inflation and core inflation, and why generally policymakers, economists prefer core, is because 1 month energy's hot, the next month it's declining, and when you're trying to make a decision based upon something that is incredibly volatile, it increases errors. An example I'll give you is with our portfolios here at Edelman Financial Engines. If we rebalanced your portfolio every time the market went up or down 1%, we'd be trading nonstop. And what that leads to, at least if you go on historical data, is inferior outcomes. And I believe the same mindset applies to why policymakers, why economists prefer to use core inflation rather than headline. It's because they can't be reactive to something that tends to be wildly volatile. And the same mindset applies to the advice we offer our investors, our clients, when we talk about staying in the market.